Thank you, Omar, and to the people at Security and Context for the invitation to chair this panel. It's both a pleasure and a privilege to be here today with Kate and with Scarlett to discuss Laura's wonderful book, and I look forward to our conversation. Given the rich interdisciplinary ethos which informs Laura's work, I should say at the outset that I am trained as a political scientist, and I would self-identify as a scholar of international relations, and my remarks reflect this background. The first thing to say is that scholars, both within and across the various disciplines, are increasingly self-aware about the ways in which something we might call the international shapes their work, whether explicitly or implicitly. So, for example, in sociology, we've seen the emergence of something called global historical sociology and international political sociology. In anthropology, we've seen the radical problematization of the field, the growth of multi-sited ethnographies, and efforts to resituate ethnography itself as a method within what Emanuel Wallerstein called the world system. This recognition is not a recent phenomenon, whether for scholars or for other actors, as Laura shows. We could go back to Trotsky, who produces the notion of combined and uneven development in order to make sense of Russia and China, or Cardozo and Folletto, whose notion of dependencia comes out of a related impulse to understand the underdevelopment of Latin America. It's worth recalling that Emanuel Wallerstein himself started his scholarly life as an Africanist. The notion of a world system emerges in the context of his inability to make sense of Africa without taking the international into account. One could proliferate examples. The international, in other words, is always there, whether it's acknowledged or not. My own discipline, international relations, has long claimed ownership of the international, and it's interesting for me to read the ways in which Laura's book draws on that scholarship. Laura is in good company here. The distinguished sociologist Michael Mann once described how his own work on the international, which bears some similarity to Laura's, was informed by what he called a raid on the discipline of international relations. At the same time, the scandal of international relations as a field is that it doesn't have a very good account of the international. It's not uncommon to meet scholars from other fields who describe how they went to international relations looking for the international and decided it wasn't very helpful. So they went looking elsewhere or made it up on their own, rather like Laura. Also like Laura, some of the most creative work in international relations is produced by feminist scholars who, following in the footsteps of Cynthia Enlow and others, in working across disciplines or in opposition to them, have shown us how the international is not out there somewhere, but right here, constituted out of the relations between gendered bodies and spaces, ranging from the intimate and the domestic to the public and the diplomatic. Which brings me to Laura's work and its location, at least as a point of departure, in literature. One of the most interesting aspects of Edward Said's work, and of those who have followed him, is the simultaneous recognition first that strategies of reading had to take account of the colonial and imperial character of the international, as both context and as constitutive texts. Second, that the institution of literature itself was produced out of those relations and was constitutive of them. And third, that it was necessary to produce an account, however provisional and uncertain, of the international itself to inform such readings. To cite just one example, which I think sums up this disciplinary response rather well, in the 1990s, Rosemary Hennessy, who's now a professor of English at Rice University, called for what she termed a global social analytic as a way of reading, one which was attentive to the ways in which what she called different regions of the social, the political, the cultural, the economic, were related one to another without being reducible one to the other. And also as a way of taking account of the ways in which some social relations, historically differentiated and never in an absolute or monocausal way, have persistently organized people's lives across social formations and specific situations. The examples she gave resonate with Laura's account of the international: capital's extraction of surplus labor, imperialism's tactics of eminent domain and white supremacy, and patriarchal gender hierarchies. So I approach Laura's work as a tremendously rich and creative contribution to this ongoing effort, the need across disciplines and shaped by particular disciplinary interests, objects, and concerns, to produce an account of the international as a necessary element in our efforts to make sense of the world and perhaps to change it. Let me now say something more directly about Laura's book before turning to our two other panelists. The core insight of Laura's book is that world politics has over time been constituted by inter-imperial relations. Laura makes this central to her account of the international and locates literature within an inter-imperial field. Second, Laura treats literature, broadly defined, she includes language, translation, and aesthetics, as mutually constitutive with the international. Indeed, while she puts inter-imperial war and conquest at the heart of her analysis, Laura also opens up an account of the international as constituted through inter-imperial cultural economies and their institutional foundations. Third, Laura deploys literature as a method through which we can analyse the international in a series of strong readings of texts such as The Thousand and One Nights and Melmoth the Wanderer, amongst others. Reflecting her disciplinary point of departure, close reading remains at the heart of her wider enterprise. Fourth, throughout, Laura is attentive to the race and especially to the gendered character of international relations, grounded in the gendered labour by which we each come into the world, which across time persistently enables imperial hierarchies of diverse kinds. There's a lot going on in this book. The book is ambitious conceptually and empirically. It draws on a wide engagement across disciplines. It's driven by a desire, it says, to put back together that which disciplines have divided. And I salute this effort. It has a long historical view and a genuinely global range of examples. The book is also ambitious politically, and this is the final point I'll make. Laura is very clear about the book's purpose. As she says, understanding the long past of diverse political imaginaries and their conditions of imagining in literature is crucial to the twin tasks of decolonising our minds and acknowledging our fundamentally dialectical conditions of relation. Relations, the denial of which is a signature of imperial social formations. It's a tremendous book, and I look forward to discussing it. With that, by way of very brief contextualisation and introduction, let me now turn to our co-panellists. I'll begin with Kate.
Hello, can you hear me? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Great, thanks. Thanks very much, Mark. It's lovely to be here. It's a little strange to know that there's other people listening in as well, and I can't see them, but hello. Thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on this book and be part of this conversation. I really enjoyed the book, and I wanted to start out by first of all saying that. Oh, maybe I should briefly introduce myself really briefly as well. Sorry. So my name's Kate Bedford. I'm Professor of Law at the University of Birmingham in the UK. I was trained in political science in the US, and I come at questions of international political economy, international development from a sort of gendered and more recently cultural economy angle. So I really enjoyed the book, and I wanted to first of all start out by just highlighting a few things I really valued about it in relation to our conversations about international political economy in particular. So as Mark noted, the book has a genuinely wide interdisciplinary scope. And I was really drawn to its focus on the interrelation between attachments among persons and communities and interacting geopolitical forces. And the key concept of inter-imperiality is one that I think offers an awful lot to critical studies of international political economy. So the book aims to offer what Laura calls a dialectical theory of relationality and power that's feminist and intersectional. It's economic, it's materialist, it's literary, it's geopolitical. And I think it succeeds in that. And in particular, I think that for me, the emphasis on co-constitution, mixing, relationality, co-formations, interactions, that's never a power-free, liberal, cosmopolitan celebration. Laura never loses sight of the violence, the fraughtness, the attentiveness to resistance and revolt alongside long histories of endurance. And so it succeeded for me in dislodging Eurocentric narratives of modernization, which is one of the aims of the book, in provincializing English efforts to enter the inter-imperial field. And I was really struck by the notion of a deep inter-imperial time or an endurance time. Relatedly, the book offers a long history of what Laura calls the labours of sustenance, how gender labours sustain sociality, people making, world making, and its focus on birthing and labouring bodies is particularly helpful, I think, there, and the focus on women's sexuality. upon which control of labour and racialised stratifications of labourers from rulers rests. I was especially struck by her claim that the history of rape needs to be recognised as part of the history of the world, and relatedly, that we need to take it seriously in literary texts. I'm not a literature scholar, but I was really struck by the analysis offered of the various texts in the book. The range is astonishing, really is astonishing. But the general point that literature has served as a key tool in an inter-imperial field, fully entangled in empire, to use Laura's words, while also providing the basis for counter-hegemonic imaginaries. It's very well made, I think. And the key takeaway from the book for me, one of them, is the value of a broader methodological approach to international political economy. One women might look to novels or to music maybe to learn about the history of debt. And I say music here because Laura gives the example of Stephanie Black's 2001 film Life and Debt to note the foundational force of debt in Caribbean economies. And I teach about structural adjustment using the soundtrack to that film. And I'll also, because I thought I'd have 30 seconds on gambling. I'm a gambling scholar in part. I will briefly mention that this part of the book where you discuss debt is the key place where you discuss gambling. So you've got some references to gambling and debt there, gambling as decadence. And if I may have my 30 seconds on gambling, there is absolutely no doubt that gambling has played a role in dispossession, indebtedness, and exploitation within racialized and gendered labor regimes. But in the spirit of forging counter-hegemonic accounts that are attuned to the labor involved in enduring resistance, I will wager that if we poke around in that example, we will find also that gambling created community solidarities, helped with redistribution, functioned as a form of mutual aid, and had resistant connotations that have been disavowed by those who can only see gambling through a neoliberal prism of individualistic risk-taking. I talk a little bit about this in my work, but Amy Chaskell tackles it in her brilliant history of the illegal numbers game lottery in Rio, and I think you would really love that book. So I have my 30 seconds on gambling. But to go back to debt, I was absolutely convinced methodologically that the gendered and racialized dimensions of indebtedness in inter-imperial timeframes were better captured by the literary texts that you use than the sort of sources on which international political economists would normally rely. Reading the book right now in the UK, in the midst of a culture war where the right-wing press and the government are targeting post-colonial and feminist historical work that troubles a glorified notion of Britishness, I was really struck by the distinction that you make between memories of connection and sustenance and violence and the disavowals of authorized history. And I ended the book absolutely convinced that literature would give us access to some of those memories, including around debt. So in terms of things I'd love to hear more about, or curiosities that were prodded into being by the book, I'll mention three if I can. So the first one, the three, one is about gender, one is about the decolonial and the post-colonial. And the third one is about the moment where you end in the book, where you offer us a quite institutionalist vision of resistance and endurance. So on gender, the book centers the work of labouring women, as Mark has noted and has came out for me as well very strongly, work of birth and care. And it refuses, existentially speaking, to disavow relationality and enmeshment. You write of women's status as pawns in a whole terrain of men jockeying in empire. And I wondered about the key variations or changes or shifts in this experience of gender and labour over the long history of empires. So gradations of imperial patriarchy, if you like, women's role as imperial actors, times when and places where racialized men did key care labor as servants. And the second curiosity that was prodded for me, and prodded into being by the book, I suppose, was, and I'm risking here turning to a topic that the book explicitly tries to move past, so forgive me, but I would like to hear more about the decolonial and the post-colonial tensions in the book, or the third versus the fourth world approaches to empire and coloniality. So early in the book, Laura notes Simpson's work on the Mohawk refusal to allow a Canadian disavowal of a state-to-state relationship. And that disavowal for legal scholars is obviously quite tricky given Crown treaties. But the book suggests that the decolonial and the post-colonial are connected at the root and are best seen as complementary. And absolutely take that point. But by the end of the book, the discussion is on diasporic subjects as emblematic of the shatter zones of empire. And the indigenous experience of coloniality has a little slipped by this point. And that makes absolute sense, given the geographical focus on the Caribbean by the end of the book, where genocide was almost total. But in other shatter zones, so Central America, for example, indigeneity would play a much more central role in our long histories of inter-imperiality, gendered, what Laura calls gendered and racialized love laws involved in state formation. They would have to contend much more explicitly with plural legal systems. This isn't a criticism of the book. Even long world-spanning histories of empires can't cover everything everywhere. But I do wonder if the emphasis on the diasporic experience of inter-imperiality might take us away somewhat from the experiences of those who remain stuck in what we might think of as the left behind places or abandoned by capital. And I'm not positioning this as a dichotomy, some diaspora has become left behind. But if we follow the migrations in our geography of inter-imperiality looks one way. And if we stay in the shatter zone over time, long time, especially a shatter zone where indigeneity endures and refuses disavowal, then our geography might look a little bit different. And finally, I wanted to pick up almost where the book ends, where Laura writes about the potential for authors to listen and witness and imagine and lead readers back through what Laura calls the repeating betrayals of the past in order to prompt our imagining of another future. And soon after writing this, Laura notes that this reimagining is often now one that hinges on states that structure relations and that also provide leverage for justice-seeking actors. And the actors here are nonprofits, healthcare, women's shelters, schools, and so on. And I'm absolutely with Laura on this. But I was struck by the fact that the book ends with quite an institutionalist vision of leverage. And yet it doesn't say an awful lot about collective institutional leverage in relation to arts and literature. The authorial voice remains quite an individual voice. And we miss maybe the radical reimagining that might stem from a collective efforts to undo the author. And I'm not just saying this because this panel prompted me, because some of the people are at UMass, and I always think of J.K. Gibson Graham when I think of UMass in terms of collective efforts to undo the author. So for me, I wondered if part of the limit here is this around literature. Is it still imagined as a solitary pursuit of great authors, and a focus on dance or theatre or music might lead us to more obviously collective reimaginings in complex negotiation with state structures? And again, this isn't a criticism of the book. It's a vast undertaking in its own terms, and its contribution, I think, needs to be assessed in those terms. But it was interesting to me that it ended on quite an institutionalized collective vision of leverage. And I'd love to hear more about that if we have time.
Thank you, Kate. Can we now turn to Scarlett?
Okay, thanks a lot, Mark. And I also would like to thank Omar and the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion of Laura's book, Inter-Imperiality. I'm Scarlett Cornelissen. I'm talking to you from South Africa. I'm at Stellenbosch University, which is down south in South Africa. And my work is on IR. Mostly it's been on African international relations, and I have done work on Japan as an actor on the African continent. I also follow the other panelists by warmly congratulating Laura for really a remarkable book. I learned a lot from it and I enjoyed reading it immensely. It is a triumph, it's a tour de force. In terms of theory, the book is highly textured and rich, and it is exquisite in its detail, and the extent and the depth of the research is very impressive. I will start off my comments with a brief positioning of the book to the fields of IPE and IR, and reflect on how the book provides insights that help advance both disciplines. And of course, all the panelists here are from either IR or IPE. Thereafter, I will single out two key epistemological features of the book, namely, and I think here there are some resonances with the points and the comments and questions that Kate made. So namely, first, on the one hand, the book's post-colonial, decolonial grounding. Laura prefers the decolonial. I will be using post-colonial, decolonial in an encompassing way, not to do disservice to the contrast between these two rich intellectual strands, but simply for the purpose of my discussion. And then the other aspect is the value of the hermeneutical, what I see to be the hermeneutical approach that underpins the book. And I will do things a little bit in reverse to what Kate has just now done. So I will reflect on what these two aspects that I identified, the post-colonial, decolonial grounding and the hermeneutical underpinning, what they bring for my own work on Africa's international relations, and then invite Laura to comment on what I take out of her work then for my work on Africa's IR. Africa, as I will discuss, is mainstream IR's castaway, the aberrant other, at best on the periphery of international relations, or at worst completely ignored by Anglo-Atlantic IR scholars. A big part of my work over the years has been to address this part, this neglect on the part of mainstream IR. And Professor Doyle's book provides great insights as far as that's concerned. So the aim of my intervention is to demonstrate how the pathways followed in the book help us to reframe IR, to address the flaws of IR, and through that to give us deeper understanding of Africa in the international, both in present and past. So to start off, echo Mark and Kate that in perspective, in methodology and voice, Inter-Imperiality objects loudly to challenges and demonstrates the flaws in the disciplinary norms of IR and IPE. The standard framing of the IR and IPE canon advances assumptions that A, the world is readily comprehensible through objective scholarly inquiry, B, that phenomena can be understood by separating social reality into fixed separable categories, that is state, market, labor, and power, and these are treated as independents, and C, that coherent understanding can be achieved by drawing connections between these artificially separated phenomena. The problem is that, ironically, while rooted in politics and ostensibly addressing questions of politics, these assumptions of IR and IPE eschew the political. The many silences and omissions in stock standard IR and IPE maintain a system of knowledge production that does not particularly extend importance to how contemporary processes of global relations, global capitalism, and global power determine how life is actually lived and felt by those who are at the mercy of its dictates. and importantly, how all of it came to be. So as such, much of what's standard in IR and IPE neglects history, subjectivity, and micro-agency. In this regard, Inter-Imperiality's advances over the canon can be said to be the following. It is presenting an advance in terms of temporality. The book's advances are also hermeneutic, experiential, and emancipatory. And it's those latter two aspects, the experiential and the emancipatory, that gets delved out in the book, that I think are of particular resonance for Africa's IR. Professor Doyle Laura skillfully foregrounds the political, giving historical content to the state. And I think her major contribution is to show how the state, or in her discussion, empires and their role in capitalist production, how these were molded through competing interests at multiple levels of social life over the longue durée, and importantly, how matters of the state interweave with the intimate, with identity, and with the material. To elaborate on the value and implications of this approach for my own work on Africa's IR, I would like to follow a series of steps. To begin with, as said, there's a long-standing neglect of the African continent in mainstream IR. The continent is not theorized about or is left out of theory building. Africa is the archetypal other, capital O, within the Westphalian order, and it is seen as delinquent, the site of conflict and disorder. Laura's work helps us to see why this is so, why Africa is framed this way in mainstream IR. It's part of a normalizing discourse with deep historical, intellectual, and violence roots that services a discipline with very specific objectives, given its Anglo-Atlantic origins. Mainstream IR's othering of the African continent, and for that matter, the global South, legitimates a scholarship premised on given understandings of what constitutes the normal condition. That is the normal condition as based on values and knowledge paradigms rooted in European modernity. All of these which Inter-Imperiality skillfully upends. Because the African continent sits uncomfortably with IR's paradigms and does not neatly fit into IR's ideal form typologies, mainstream IR tends to peripheralize the continent simply because it is challenging to explain. But there are more than disciplinary or scholarly consequences. It's also experiential. The African condition, African subjectivities, African experiences within the international order are rendered wholly invisible. Thus, any effort towards addressing the flaws in IR concerning the African continent is more than merely intellectual, it's also political. And this is where I think Laura's work is very useful here. And there are two aspects that are salient. As I said, the hermeneutical grounding, and second, Laura's deep and serious engagement with the post-colonial, decolonial project. The two are consonant, I think, and I think this is also where I would add to what Kate has been saying about post-colonialism and decolonialism, and also the way the use of literature to uncover some of the dynamics there. But I see that the hermeneutical narrative that underpins Laura's work, as well as post-colonialism and decolonialism, or the decolonial project, are consonant. There are synergies between narrative hermeneutics and the post-colonial decolonial project. Both center on the interpretive study of human lives. An essential element of hermeneutical analysis is meaning making, not simply as reasoning or comprehension, but as living life in a cultural world. It is about the human condition itself. Hermeneutical narrative analysis goes beyond the meaning of texts. The prime purpose is to grapple with ontological issues, to deal with human subjectivity in the world as a historical, social, and cultural condition. I think Laura's discussion shows us how this process of the interpretive study of human life within world historical contexts achieves a number of things. It allows deeper understanding of complex human affairs, temporal processes, and multi-temporal scenarios. It intermingles the past with the present to give a more complete account of the relational systems that make up the international of today, and it advances insights into the materialities that underpin these relational systems. From the vantage point of the global south, and in my case, Africa, there is an added emancipatory dimension that is underlined by the post-colonial, decolonial critique embedded in Laura's discussion. In a word, it leads to a scholarly project that emphasizes the need to create alternative presence and alternative futures through scholarly inquiry. So taken together then, there are a number of inspirations I take from Laura's analysis for African IR, and they all pivot on critiques of modernity and the subject positions tied to it, as Homi Bhabha's use of the post-colonialism implies, that is, subjectivity originating outside of modernity. The first is in terms of alternative hermeneutics, looking at and interpreting the African continent, its societies and its processes, not only through the standard IR concepts of the state, which in mainstream IR is then evaluated as failing, or in terms of sovereignty or development. Again, these are all evaluated as not following the modernist path, but to recognize the varied sources of authority on the continent in their historical and current manifestations. This helps us to understand Africa in the international and the international in Africa, less through the lens of the Westphalian state and the formal, but makes provision for the study of the informal, which is much of the African reality, namely informal economies, informal spaces of living, and how the informal establishes conduits of linkage to the global. One key example to make this a bit more concrete is in terms of, for example, analysis centered on the urban space and urban processes in Africa. At any given time, various fragments of African urban society and multiplicities of political actors in urban Africa are affected by larger economic processes and in particular by global changes in the territorial organization of capital. Subjectivities are shaped by local as well as global processes. And these subjectivities, wittingly or unwittingly, orient themselves to what's happening in an imagined larger space beyond their own reality. This makes up what is international relations in Africa, the practice of international relations in Africa. Cities, as a space of living, provide the infrastructure for the export of Africa's extractive resources. African cities pool, collect, and distribute labor to sustain those extractive industries and the global capital involved with them. African cities are also repositories or collection sites for another factor of global integration in the contemporary era, in the form of migrants or diasporas, movements, social movements, and mafias, illicit economies that link African and Northern capitals. So the point is that much insight can be gained from the nexuses of space, money, politics, and urban life on the continent that can inform us of Africa's insertion into the global arena. And these are all aspects that are ignored in the IR canon. This also gives us a different perspective on the apparent state of dysfunction, disorder, and precarity in the African urban condition. Indeed, dysfunction and disorder get reframed as heuristics, as explanatory tools for Africa in the international. So summing up this point, there's plenty of potential that lies in following subjectivity and subject positions in African processes. There's also the implication of how we deal with history. It is to reflect differently on African accounts of the continent's histories. As argued by Isabel Hofmeyr and others, for example, working in the field of Indian Ocean studies, such exercises have critical, puristic, and political value by highlighting how the African continent's history interconnects with other regions and what the influence is and have been of circulating values, ideas, and material cultures. It enables new reflection and reinterpretation of formative processes such as the forging of politics, the rise of political movements, Afro-nationalism, and the production of social life on the continent. Lastly, There is for me much promise in giving an alternative and deeper account of Africa's present relations with so-called rising powers, such as China, based on a theorization of hegemony, capitalism, and labor, as Laura demonstrates. By this account, Africa's engagement with states such as China is properly read in the context of the historical structure of global capitalism, where China is not simply seen as a state seeking a place in the global system, but as a social formation whose ascendance into Africa is recognized in the context of broader changes in the historical and structural conditions of global capitalism. And this perspective should be complemented with one focused on African workers' experiences and encounters of this global capital. Once again, this involves multi-scale and multi-vectored analysis with the place for subjectivity, as Laura's discussion points us towards. So I've outlined some things that I think that I have found inspiration in from Laura's book. There's which I would like her comment on if there's time. But there's a bigger question actually, which has been underlying all of this, and it's about the place of Africa in your work, Laura, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa in the vast swathes of history that you cover in the book. Where do you see? I don't speak specifically about Africa as part of the Mediterranean. I speak specifically of the sub-Saharan African subcontinent, where you see that fitting in your discussion. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura, I'll give you some opportunity to respond.
My goodness. Thank you all very much for reading the book. And one thing I've learned in the course of writing this book is how much it matters who you are thinking with. So I'm grateful to all the people I've been thinking with over the last 10 years in writing it. And now I'm grateful to you all for sharing your thoughts with me and allowing me to think with you. So again, it's a real gift and I appreciate it very much. I'm glad you liked it. Somewhat relieved. You know, social scientists, I don't know, sometimes can have a different kind of discourse than people in the humanities. So I didn't know how this would go. So to be more specific and to be as brief as possible so that maybe there would be a broader dialogue with people who are listening. Let's see, I haven't had much time to order how I want to address this, but I think what I will do, and please remind me if there are things that I don't remember to touch on. I think I'll start with the post-colonial, decolonial, since it came up in both Kate's and Scarlett's comments. And I very much appreciate putting a little pressure on that. And while I still would say that post-colonial traditions of thinking and decolonial traditions of thinking are complementary and in some way maybe connected at the root, that's a step I'm going to think a little more about in light of your comments, especially yours, Kate. I very much take your point about, especially in light of my saying I favor the decolonial, the degree to which I think less and work less with indigenous histories and struggles than I do with places where I focus as the book goes on those places that became shatter zones in later periods. I think one place I would point to where I do something a little bit wider, although still briefly, and this also addresses your point, Scarlett, about the place of Africa in the book. So chapter 5, which is dealing with the early 20th century, end of 19th, early 20th century. So the The South African Wars or the Anglo-Boer Wars are in that picture. Wars with the many wars. I mean, mainly what I do there is just list the many indigenous wars the wording, and the point I would always make is the words we choose are so important. So whether it's called South African, whether it's called Anglo-Boer, also to call them wars. So many massacres were involved. And is that a war? Maybe we need to pause over that. So, but in the case of South Africa, I'll use South African wars. As I try to name there, it was an intensive inter-imperial zone. And China was in the mix and Russia was in the mix as well as the Western European states in terms of who they were supporting, right? So it was where the arms were coming from. And as I mentioned briefly there, the Boers turned to Russia for support through our support in arms and other kinds of military support, and Russia withholds it. And that had very much to do with Russia's relationship to Britain and to other places, other states. So again, that's just to put forward, there is brief, I'm aware of that history. I try to mention it, but yeah, it's both indigenous histories and including in Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa never become central points of focus in the book. So that just needs to be said, and I'm glad you said it. And I think there's rich material, obviously, rich thinking to be done about it. I mean, the other thing to say, I think, about Africa is that the fuller colonization of states really happened quite late in many places, so East Africa and all that history is so of course I'm aware of the whole slave trade and what happened there, but that was less, it had huge impact, of course, on those states of West Africa, but it was not a full colonization in terms of settler colonialism to the same degree that was happening, say, in India in 17th, 18th century. So I think that there's plenty to think about there, and I didn't get there. One thing, I'll just sort of follow my train of thought here, I guess, but about, Scarlett, I appreciated what you were saying about the informal political formations and the micropolitics and all of that. And I'm no expert, but have a sense of that. And but I think it's also important to, when I teach students, for instance, to talk about the states, the pre-European colonial states of Africa. I also pause over the word pre-colonial because, and it's open to lots of debate, when Islamicate states came and formed in various parts of Africa, are we calling that colonialism? And if so, we should be aware of how we use the word pre-colonial. But in any case, sophisticated states, right? The whole thing that you would, the word sophisticated itself is loaded here, but yeah, very organized states with administration, not always using paper and literacy, but often. And so to me, it's also important when I'm teaching, at least, to emphasize this, because students from elsewhere, especially European background students, they'll thank me. They'll say, "Oh my God, how did I not know any of this?" So I think that that's really important to keep talking about. Another thing just to mention is the relationship between Asia and Africa that is very old. And so what happens when we just at least remember that in today's relations, So I think I might myself want to think more about both the capitalist account of why China is in Africa right now, and the sort of more modernity contemporary account of it. I mean, I'm not saying that it means they're old friends and we should just not worry about this. I'm just saying that what I'm asking us to ask, you know, what happens when you add that back into the picture? And I think it pulls us back from some of the places we go to first in thinking about China and Africa. Let's see now. The gendered and racialized labor, Kate, that you bring up, I'm going to be brief, so I'll just say yes, that there are many variations and ways to think about both gendering and racialization that are very particular to place and time. And forgive me for that very brief comment on that, but there's plenty more thinking to do on that. I very much appreciate your comments, Scarlett, on the hermeneutics and the underlying sort of epistemological questions here that I do think, as I argue in the book, literature can really help us think about. That's its work in the world, as far as I'm concerned. And it is paying attention to the long histories in a way that we haven't even been able to notice literature doing that because we're not paying enough attention to it. I'm going to say a few things that are, build on what I'm saying and aren't directly addressing some of the comments that you each brought up. And that has to do with, it's related to this point about epistemology, ontology, and hermeneutics. Narrative. Again, this sounds so familiar, it doesn't seem worth saying, but the importance of narratives to our living in the world, and how much it matters what narratives we are telling without realizing we're telling. And so I just want to name a few things that I have in mind here. And one has to do very importantly with periodizing words. So all these words, the very word modern, I mean, sometimes I just think, let's stop saying that word. What if we just excised it from our vocabularies? What would we have to do? What work would we have to do to find other things to say? So much is organized around modernity, the modernization. And while I think modernization is a valuable term, that's the most valuable to me because it names a process of intensification of state building, economic formations, labor formations, and technology and infrastructure being at the heart of a lot of that. So there's been a modernization, and we could call it that because modernity is so affiliated with technologies and sophisticated systems and all. But modernity as a periodization is a problem. And when you read the historiography, this is what happened to me. I started reading this historiography about pre-European hegemony, and and this happens. I watch it with my students all the time, and they just say, "Oh, wow!" And what happens is that their centers slightly shift, and their coordinates slightly shift for thinking about today. And so to me, these periodizing terms are something that we could all revisit. A lot of it goes back to Johann Fabian's idea of denial of coevalness, because what happens is that there's a periodizing, basically a racialized periodizing of world history, and so we modernity is a racialized term. Let's admit it openly. And so I would really want to urge us to keep wondering how we're going to break that apart. I think also that another very quickly, what's deeply embedded in our narratives, and a lot of this comes out of teaching, is win, lose, success, failure. So this goes back to the failed state problem. I'm talking about like deeply, what are our children learning? How are you going to succeed? Did you lose the game? I really think that we could pause over this without, losing all hold on narrative. So I just want to put that out there. Who won World War I? Who won? We could say certain states gained power and gained land and all, but is won the right word? So though at the level of vocabulary, this is of course the literary scholar in me, I'm always thinking, now why that word? What other word might we use there? And then the last thing I want to say, I think, is that one of the things that literature has trained me always to be aware of is what's not being told, this part of the story that's not being told. And so narratives, I mean, this is Jacques Derrida, yes, but it's working it through at lots of levels. The anchoring but absent center of the narrative. And so there's the elision of labor, and I think labor is at the heart of what's getting elided here, and it goes back to what I argue about the labor of any of us being alive, and the way that gets continually elided. And I think there's a defensiveness in that, and there's an existential fear in that dependency, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to also mention in this context 2 books that are literary books. And one is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, which you may know. And she uses the term Africanism. And what she's trying to describe with that term is the way in which African descended people and she's just talking about US American literature, will appear in texts, but as background. So the man rowing the boat, and there's a comment by Hemingway in a story about his dark skin and his face, but that's not what the story is about at all. And she and other people have done this with servants or with women in text. They're there, they're pivotal. Everything depends on their action, but they're not part of the story. So narratives are often structured in this way, sometimes to expose the elision, sometimes not. And I think if we think in our macro narratives, our narratives, our IR narratives, about it's not just that, oops, forgot about Africa, forgot about those people who were struggling on the ground that actually had a lot to do with the outcome of that invasion. It's not just that oops, I forgot that, but that the narrative itself depends on that forgetting. And so elision, forgetting, these are terms that I think IR scholars could potentially begin to incorporate as we're incorporating post-colonial, decolonial. And I could say a little bit more on the post-colonial, decolonial. I'd love to continue the conversation. The other point I want to address is the collective institutional ending of the book. And that is really meant to call out to all of us, because so there are lots of ways to go with the vision of the future and who will participate and make that. But one for us is certainly through the institutions we work at. And I think we don't use the power we have enough or admit to it sometimes. So to me, for instance, with the World Studies Interdisciplinary Project that Mwangi and I have built together, in our first meeting, we went to the Vice Chancellor of Research and Engagement, and we said, we want to have this conference. We need to get people together to talk about the narratives that aren't in our narratives. And we want to bring people, and we need some money. And they said, of course, so what will be your product? And we said, the product is the conversation. It's too soon for a product. We don't even know what we're doing. We just know we need to talk to each other. And much to our surprise, after a little bit more dialogue, they said, you're right. Because half of them are scholars or were, and they know it. And so I think pushing back on the norms, sometimes it doesn't work, maybe most of the time it doesn't work, but I think we could push harder against these disciplinary divisions, and then to say to the administrators, well, you want interdisciplinary, this is actually what it's going to take. It's going to take investing in these conversations and giving them people time. It's not just about money, it's about time. And so comes back to temporality at some level. So I'll stop there. And I just thank you all very much for this conversation. And I'd love to hear other questions and from the audience or you all.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you very much. Omar has asked me to remind other attendees that they can post questions in the Q&A. I'm not quite sure how much time we've got left, but if I might invoke Chair's privilege to ask a couple of questions, perhaps while we're waiting to see if any of the other attendees have things that they would like to ask. And I do strongly encourage people who are attending to pose questions if you have them. I wanted to ask a question about the role of war in your account. And I guess my question's in two parts. So the first thing that's striking for me as an international relations scholar who has an interest in war is how central interstate, inter-imperial war is in your account. So on the one hand, I recognize the ways in which you have a dialectical approach to thinking about the world, and gendered labor and so forth is integral to that, and states obviously rest in some very specific sense on a distribution of gendered bodies and labors and spaces and so forth. Nevertheless, from a traditional international relations point of view, the idea that the core dynamic, which is shaping and reshaping the world, is warfare is not a surprising one. And I'm interested to hear you say something about how you account for that. And I wonder if that might be usefully linked to a question about what you call in the book imperial subjectification or subjectivation.
Yeah, it's a hard word. Subjectivization, I believe is the proper.
Which on the one hand, I thought was a really interesting concept, and I wanted to hear you say something about it, because I didn't find a sort of a discussion of it more formally in the book. And I want to link that not only to the centrality of war, but also to the, I guess, the longue durée nature of your analysis. Because one of the things that strikes me is if my suspicion that imperial subjectivation is in some ways integral to your understanding of warfare and why war is and conquest is reproduced persistently over time, then it has something to do with the reproduction of imperial subjectivation. And I wondered if there was scope there for deepening your account of the role of literature. Because I started to think about, well, we're mostly talking here about relatively small, because you talk about states doing all sorts of things, including going to war. But really we're talking about relatively small groups of mostly men making decisions to use force in negotiating their political and other relations. And then I started thinking, well, what kinds of stories, what kinds of texts are these people being subjected to? And I wondered, well, are they reading the Odyssey? Are they, what kinds of texts, in addition to the 1001 Nights, for example, are they subjected to? And how do those contribute to processes of imperial subjectivation? And whether that was what was responsible for the reproduction over time of this particular form of social action.
Thank you. I'm going to again try to be really brief and just say that first I'm going to mention other scholars. So I think Mary Louise Pratt has an article in a PMLA, it's the main the organ of the Modern Language Association. In 2015, Sahara Amar and I did a special section, and Mary Louise Pratt published an essay in that, and she gives the best account of subjectivization, imperial subjectivization, of any I've read, and it's very succinct. And so I would just point there to her definition of that, which does have much to do with schooling, and it also, very importantly in her account, has to do with language. So when one state or one people invades and tries to control the lands and the resources and the labor of the other, they're bringing another language. And so as you can imagine, right, your subjectivity is so grounded in language as a human that if you're forced to speak and learn, respond to a different language, every molecule in your body sort of adjusts, if you know what I mean. And so it does crucially involve language. In terms of then narratives and stories and how that builds subjects who will fight in wars, I think that's that's a very good point, and to focus us right on that is very helpful. I would point to all of the legends. I would point to the Bhagavad Gita, which is all about why am I fighting? And then there's not yet convincing to me, but apparently, convincing to the listeners that no war, we have to fight war. And I think that there are so many ways. I mean, gendering has much to do with it, right? I think Nancy Chodorow still could play a role there in terms of our identities understood as different from the person who might have kept us alive, where I'm not her, I'm him, that there's something complicated in there. And then I just will quickly make a pitch for this novel, Melmoth the Wanderer, which is it's about 700 pages. So not everyone wants to read it, and it's a Gothic novel of the early 19th century, but boy, does he name this matter of people being conscripted into fighting war. So there is conscription, and that's another part of it. A lot of people don't want to fight, but they're forced to. And then why do states war? I guess there are probably many ways to think about this, but I go to simply, there are a lot of deep questions. Why do people want power? All of that. But I think wars have been linked to states that want to expand. And I think, though, one bit I might add to the normal thinking about it, wealth, power, all of that, is health. Care people who will be your servants. And I think we often leave out the question of health as part of what, health very broadly understood, part of what states, it's part of why people sign on to them, protection of their bodies, but also maybe some services. It's also why when you get to be, an elite or someone who is not struggling physically and materially, one of the things you really want is someone to take care of your household and someone to make the food, clean up, keep it sanitary. And so I think that that's actually a desire. Who wants to, right? I mean, get up at 5 a.m. and change the diaper. No one actually. And so you got to work it out, and it's a struggle. So I'll stop there. I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 7 minutes left, I think. There is a question from one of the attendees. I'll just read it out. So Laura, could you speak more about the relationship between inter-imperiality and coloniality? Maybe also as a way to strategically avoid referring to modernity. Thank you.
Great suggestion. Thank you. Well, I would say that first, I'm going to guess that the person asking the question might have the formulation by Escobar and Mignolo and Latin American thinkers about modernity coloniality. So they make the case, and it's like, you know, combine an uneven development in a sense that you don't have modernity without coloniality, that you need to colonize to get this modern world that we have, for all the reasons we've been talking about. And so I appreciate, if that's in this person's mind, that point about how to step it out of modernity, and think inter-imperiality and coloniality. I guess I might say, as a first pass, that if we aren't periodizing, and we think about the fact that within modernity terms, and we recall that things that are very different from empires in the 19th century or neo-empires today, whatever you want to call it, but are something people have been calling empires for a long time. Those date back to the ancient period. So I guess the first thing I might say is that if empires are old, coloniality is very old. And I think of coloniality actually in relationship to the making of subjects, subjectivization in all dimensions. So I hope this is helpful. If I'm being colonized, that likely means a number of things. I'm forced to speak in or answer to a language other than the one I've been speaking in. And that change, if sustained over generations, will be an afterlife of coloniality. And so will the laws, the kinship rules, the marriage practices, and to go back to Kate's point, the legacies of rape, the legacies of war and harm of all kinds, those will be your state of having been colonized. They will constitute coloniality. And I think part of what I'm adding to the picture, and I'm not the only person, you know, the multipolar is actually insecurity in context. And so it's more maybe specific than just multipolar, but what I'm emphasizing with the term inter-imperial is that state of being colonized, and increasingly as empires expand and there's more connecting technologies and infrastructures, that state of being colonized, and when you live it, you know it. The problem for you isn't just the one empire whose language you might have to speak, whose schools you might have to attend, whose labor you might have to do, but the other ones that are all around you that might come next. And this is a point in the book that I think is worth emphasizing, so what that means for you in the third worldism and all that, which is part of what Kate was asking about, is that, well, you might end up making a covert alliance with empire number 2 in order to get arms to fight, or in some way subvert empire number 1, your main problem. And then there's number 3, though. So I think that this situation of which I call inter-imperial positionality might also overlap in a large degree with what this question and others have called coloniality. And I'm describing it obviously from the point of view of the colonized more than the colonizer, but I think that makes sense to me. So I hope that addresses the question to some degree. Thank you.
So do I. All right, unless either of Kate or Scarlett have any final brief question they'd like to ask, I will thank Laura very much for writing a tremendously stimulating and exciting book. And I thoroughly recommend it to those who are attending the session. I think it's stimulating, and it speaks to a whole range of different aspects of international relations, IPE, and indeed to other disciplines as well, who are trying to think about the international and how we make sense of it. So thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, Kate and Scarlett, for excellent comments. And thank you to Security in Context for organising today's session. Thank you very much.
If I may just say a thank you to everyone who's attended, and to Omar again, and to Mark, Kate, and Scarlett very much. And since I never been on Facebook and I have to pause over the word tweet, I I'll just do one promotion thing. Tweet, because I can't. Yeah, but thank you again, and I hope this conversation can continue in some way. I think collaboration is important. So how could IR and Lit Scholars talk more? I would love to see us wonder about that together if there's an opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm in favor of that too. All right. Thank you, and we're done.
All right.